Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this event. I am Valina Hasu-Houston, and I want to thank the University of Southern California, the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture, USC Dornsife, Dr. Duncan Williams, who is director of the Shinso Ito Center, and Ms. Shannon Takushi for sponsoring our event today. So allow me to introduce the presenters and panelists who will participate in the Q&A after the play reading. Please refer to the website of the USC Shinso Ito Center for full bios. So today, joining us are Wayne Osako, who has a number of relatives who enlisted in the US Army during World War II. He serves as co-chair of the Stamp Our Story Committee, along with founder Fusa Takahashi. Both of his parents were incarcerated as children in the forced incarceration camps during World War II. The Stamp Our Story Committee is the driving force behind the ad hoc community coalition that rallied for the Go for Broke commemorative postage stamp, which was issued this year after 15 years of petitioning by supporters. Tamara Ruppert has worked as a director, producer, and actor in New York and Los Angeles in theater, film, and television, including her critically acclaimed direction of the film short Path of Dreams about Japan's immortal poet Ono no Komachi. Currently, she's working on 2 feature films and the LA production of a New York theater company show. She studied digital filmmaking at New York Film Academy in Los Angeles. She received an MFA in directing from the New School for Drama in New York City and a BA in theater from Davidson College, North Carolina. Linda Tamura is a 3rd-generation Japanese American, daughter of a World War II veteran and professor emerita of education, Willamette University. She is the author of 2 books about Japanese Americans, co-editor-in-chief of the Oregon Encyclopedia, co-curator of the Grace, Grit, and Gaman exhibit on Japanese American women at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and chair of the Oregon dedication of the U.S. Postal Service's stamp honoring Japanese American World War II veterans. As I said earlier, I'm Valina Hasu-Houston. My writing explores cultural experiences that are outside of the mainstream, including intersections, collisions, and connections. Often my explorations include Asian and Asian American experience in connection with other cultural identities. I write plays, musical theater, film and television, essays, journalism, and poetry. I began my professional career in New York at Manhattan Theater Club and have expanded globally from there. I teach in the School of Dramatic Arts here at USC and the USC Iovine Young Academy. For 6 years, I served on the U.S. Department of State's U.S.-Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Interchange and the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission. And I realized in chatting through the other bios that I also am a daughter of a veteran of World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So in the play reading of epistles today, I want to welcome these wonderful actors. Tamlin Tomita is reading Miwako Tsubuuchi, and Tamlin is a native Los Angelino, proud Asian American Pacific Islander of Okinawan, Japanese, and Filipino heritages, and a UCLA Bruin. I also am an alum of the University of California at Los Angeles. Her credits include The Karate Kid 2, Cobra Kai, The Joy Luck Club, The Day After Tomorrow, Come See the Paradise, Picture Bride, The Good Doctor, and The Man in the High Castle. Toru Masamune is playing Hank Yamamoto, also known as Henry Yamamoto. Toru was born in Madison, Wisconsin, and he grew up in Canada and Boston. His credits include Never Have I Ever. He portrays Paxton's dad, Kevin. Michael Bay's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, in which he portrays Shredder. Inception, Artificial, which is a recipient of an Emmy Award, the Goodman Theater, the Williamstown Theater Festival, and he is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Sam Cavalcante is the production manager for Epistles and also is reading the stage directions. Sam is a Brazilian writer and actor based in Los Angeles. They hold a BA in theater from USC. Their screenplay, Lavender Lights, was a semi-finalist in the Diverso Minority Report and 2019 Scriptation Showcase, was a finalist in the 2019 Screenplay Festival, and she also has the award of a top 5 screenplay at the Berlin Liftoff Film Festival 2020. Their short screenplay, Pieces of Us, was a semifinalist in the 2020 Scriptation Showcase. Most recently, they performed as a voice actor in the video games Beasts of Maravilla Island, Lucidus Mortem, and Meister High. Follow them on Twitter at Sam_voiceover. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And now on to Wayne Osako and Linda Tamura.
Hi, thank you, Valina. I'm honored to be here. Welcome to all of you in the audience. I really want to take 1 second to thank Valina, Shannon, and the Ito Center and to USC for hosting this event. I also want to thank fellow participants and webinar facilitators. Thanks to Linda, Tamara, Tamlin, Tohoru, Sam, and Jesse, and the others involved. So thank you very much. I am co-chair of the Stamp Our Story Committee, and you might be wondering, what's Stamp Our Story? We basically formed to get a stamp to honor our beloved Nisei who served during World War II. I'm a Sansei with parents who were children in the incarceration centers during the war. So it's very near and dear to my heart. My mom's older brother served, enlisted from Hart Mountain and served in the military intelligence service. And I have others who served, including an aunt in the Women's Army Corps and one relative who was killed in action in Italy. One thing that I know some of the audience are college students at USC. And you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with me? I have daughters who like to go on their devices and click through thousands and thousands of little links. What's clickable? You know, what will people be clicking on? And I really hope to argue that this is a topic that deserves to be clicked on, deserves to be recognized by the greater American community, and it's often overlooked. So excited to work with Tamlin, Tohoru, because in entertainment especially, that has such a crucial role in what shapes our young people, that we have actors, artists who can create, and Valina who can create and write plays that will speak to the younger generations like my daughters. So briefly today, I'm going to share a background on the Stamps story and on the men and women who served, the Nisei men and women. Jesse, you can, next slide. So why do we need to remember this story? We need to have a reminder that these were real people like you and me. These were USC students. At the outbreak of the war in 1941, there were approximately 130 Japanese American students at USC who were affected by the wartime incarceration. In 2008, USC honored these students during a ceremony, and about 4 years later, even granted honorary diplomas to the survivors who were around at that time. The story of Jiro Oishi was shared at the 2008 event. Jiro was a USC senior in 1941, and on his way to take his last final exam prior to graduation, and he was taken away by the FBI and imprisoned. Setsuko Matsunaga Nishi was at the event, and she's pictured at the center of this slide. She would go on to become a prominent community activist and notable race relations scholar. Setsuko was one of those young USC students forced to leave and go into the camp. She was at first a music student, and she had aspirations that were abruptly cut short. And she rose above that later to really lead a notable career in race relations and a prominent Japanese American activist. She was among tens of thousands of Southern Californians who were put into the Santa Anita racetrack horse stables to live temporarily until being transferred to other camps or being able to relocate possibly to East Coast locations. But Setsuko wanted to remind people, quote, "There is no assurance that this could never happen again. The precedent is in times of emergency, the government can do anything. And that's the part that keeps us under continuing anxiety. I think that the people of the United States have to understand what was wrong and why it happened and be absolutely sure to take steps that it won't happen again." And to the far right is a very notable USC Trojan. His name is Sei Fuji, and he's a law school alumnus who was unjustly imprisoned as well and held at first in Toonie Canyon detention station, where, by the way, my grandfather was also held. And then Sei was later sent to Santa Fe. Sei was an Issei. He was a first generation Japanese American immigrant, but he graduated from USC Law School. Can you imagine that? He was a civil rights attorney and leader, a pioneer in the local community. He started the Kashu Mainichi local newspaper. He helped protect a Japanese American hospital in Boyle Heights in the midst of the influenza pandemic back in the early 1920s. And they often turned away Japanese Americans who were sick at hospitals during that pandemic, which has resonance today. So he tried to make sure that a Japanese American hospital could be set up, and one was set up in Boyle Heights, right here in Los Angeles. He also was pivotal to start the Nisei Week Festival here. So both Setsuko and Sei, I just want to point them out. And some of you in the audience already know about them, but I want to point out to those who don't. I'm going to go over a brief overview of the Nisei who served. Over 30,000 American men and women of Japanese American heritage served in the US military during World War II. Setsuko Matsunaga Nishi's husband, Ken Nishi, was a Japanese American World War II veteran, and he served in the special services of the US Army. So she is one link to this story. These men and women were mostly college-age students. Some were graduating from high school. Some had just entered college or were planning to. Some were already employed in jobs across the country. Their parents were immigrants from Japan. And due to this connection, they were put into the camps. In a moment, you're going to hear from Linda Tamura, who's going to share about one of my family friends, George Akiyama, the late George Akiyama, who served in the 100th Battalion. And, he was one of those who enlisted, who wanted to show their American loyalty through enlisting in the US military. Next slide, please. In 2005, on the left, Fusa Takahashi and Aiko King, they had the idea, they conceived of an idea to start a campaign to honor these men and women who served, and they started the Stamp Our Story committee and campaign. We did, in the center picture, we set up booths around at festivals, across the country. Volunteers did similarly. And finally, this year in June, on June 3rd, the US Postal Service issued the Go for Broke Soldiers stamp pictured on the right, which you can still buy until December, and then the Postal Service ceases to sell that stamp from their website. Okay, next slide. We formed to rally family, friends, colleagues, strangers, lawmakers, and even French citizens and leaders from towns that liberated Nisei, that the Nisei liberated from the German forces during the war. Locals in these French towns, such as in Bruyères and Bifontaine, remember the Nisei and honor them even today. And they helped to rally for the Go for Broke stamp. In this image, it's a collage that shows in the center 3 of the veterans who attended the LA stamp ceremony, and the stamp right between them. Next slide, please. This shows all the different people nationwide and across our country and overseas that helped in the stamp campaign. And some of them I've never met personally, but I've become friends virtually or by correspondence because of what they did. Notably in the far left corner, Carol Herhold, who has no Japanese American ancestry or connection directly, just felt it was the right thing to do. And she was a retired woman who pushed for the Illinois state legislature to pass a resolution. Next slide. We did petitions nationwide. We got governors to sign letters of support, like Governor Herbert in the center. And on the far left shows a petition from France. And on the far right, the Takai Chu congressional Dear Colleague letter that was signed by a number of Congress members to support this effort. Okay, last slide. Okay, Linda's going to share about George, and then I wanted to share before we leave that the Japanese American National Museum has letters that you can read now that shows Japanese American soldiers corresponding with loved ones back home in the camps. This is from the Kondo letters, and Stanley Hayami illustrated diary and letters are also available, and you can link to these through Stamp Our Story. And on our YouTube channel at the Los Angeles ceremony video, we also featured letters in our ceremony. Okay, I'd like to introduce Linda Tamura, who's a personal friend, and she will share about George.
We were pleased to have former Governor Ted Kulongoski as our honorary chair and Nisei veteran Yoshi Tokiwa with us. But I'd like to tell the story, as Wayne mentioned, of a Nisei veteran. George Akiyama was a quiet, matter-of-fact young man who grew up on an orchard in Hood River, Oregon. His parents had told him, do the best you can and what's best for your country. But after Pearl Harbor was bombed, his father was taken by the FBI and imprisoned for 13 months. And his mother and siblings were incarcerated during World War II. George was drafted before the war, and he was a replacement for the 100th Battalion and served in France and Italy. You may have heard of the Gothic Line. The Germans had created a fortress atop Italy's rugged Apennine Mountains. And it was so steep that at the top, they could peer down and see the approaching enemy. The Japanese Americans, the Nisei goal was to crack that Gothic line. And so they were to scale the sheer cliffs, and Company A, George's unit, was to conduct a frontal attack on what they called Georgia Hill. Now in his unit, George was one of 2 who volunteered. They volunteered to scale the top part of the cliffs, and George had 6 grenades in his pockets. His role was to throw those into the German bunkers above. Amazingly, the Nisei soldiers drove the Germans from their fortress in 32 minutes. And in war, George earned both a silver and a bronze star. Finally, in December 1945, George was able to head home. And here you'll hear an excerpt from the Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble's Oregon Stories.
When George was discharged from Fort Lewis, he took a bus to his hometown, Hood River. He was looking forward to seeing his family. George was wearing his uniform with his medals, and he decided he needed to get a haircut before he saw his mother and his father and his family. He went to a barber shop downtown that he had frequented in the past. Now, he saw the sign that says, "No Japs Wanted." But he was wearing his uniform, he had his medals, and he'd been to the barber shop before. So he saw an empty seat and he sat down. He waited a while and he wasn't served.
What happened next was a shock.
Suddenly, the barber came over. He was waving a razor in his hand, and he looked at George and said, "I ought to slit your throat." George was incredulous, and he looked at the barber and said, "You're worse than some of the Germans we fought." And he walked out.
It so happened that Captain Sheldon Lawrence had witnessed the entire incident. He didn't know George. He didn't know where he lived, but he found out. He drove his car to the bottom of the hill, and even though it was snowing hard, he walked up the hill, knocked on the door of the Akiyama home, and apologized to George. Captain Lawrence also wrote a letter to the Oregonian newspaper. "Must I return to my community and witness such unjustified prejudice and insults to some of the nation's best fighting men?" Their community had gained national notoriety during and after the war. There was an honor roll on the side of the county courthouse with the names of all 1,600 who had served in our country's armed forces. The names of 16 were blotted out with ink. They were all Japanese Americans, and George's name was included. George told me, "We just wanted to prove that we were just as good citizens as the rest of them. We don't want any minority group to be treated like that again." Staff Sergeant George Akiyama and Captain Sheldon Lawrence were models of courage. Our challenge today, how can we be allies for liberty and justice for all? Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for that wonderful performance. Thank you, Tamlin, Toru, Sam, thank you, and Tamara, thank you for your directing. So we've seen a lot of different facets of the Japanese American experience connected to World War II, music, musical theater, drama, legitimate theater, what's called legitimate theater, but it's all legitimate to me, but theater, stage on stage with the stage reading. And so we've also seen some great photographs. I mean, just amazing. And by the way, the minute I first spoke with Wayne, I went onto the US Postal Service when the stamp was issued and ordered a lot of stamps. I won't tell you how many. But because it's going off the website in December, if you haven't gotten some of the stamp sets, please do, because I can never, ever remember seeing an Asian or Asian American image on a US Postal Service stamp. And it's that in and of itself is thrilling, but it's also thrilling to have such an important part of our history commemorated in the stamp. So now we're going to have a Q&A, and if the others could join me, that would be great. And for you audience members, what we'll be doing is if you have a question about anything that you witnessed today in the event, please, I believe, and the college can correct me, but that they can put that into the Q&A chat, and then I will announce the question, and whatever panelists you'd like me to address it to, just let me know and we'll do that. So I'm looking for a Q&A. There aren't any questions yet. Does anyone have a question? Okay, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, so maybe I'll just go to each of you panelists and ask you if you have any response or any additional information you'd like to pass on to our audience members. Wayne?
Yeah, Valina, one thing, and by the way, the play really resonated with me, and on many levels. So I really want to express that. But where did you find inspiration to write the play and for the characters? And can you give us some background?
Certainly. I mean, one of my best friends is a woman named Takayo Fisher. She's now 88 years old, and she was in an internment camp. And throughout our friendship, she has talked to me a lot about the experience of being a teenager in an internment camp, and also the experience of wanting to be an actress in a Japanese American cultural environment. So that was a large part of what inspired me. And then also I'm inspired by a wonderful playwright and short story writer named Wakako Yamauchi, who has since passed away. And Wakako was one of the first people I met when I moved to Los Angeles. And she too talked to me a great deal about her experience in the camps. And of course, the plays that she wrote allowed me to experience what it was like for Japanese Americans before the forced incarceration camps, and then also afterwards. And I think you know this about me. My mother is not Japanese American, but Japanese. And so she and I were always very interested in what was happening within the Japanese American experience, both historically and currently. And so that has led me to write a lot about different aspects of both Japanese and Asian American experience. And all those things, I guess, are drivers in wanting to make sure that history is not forgotten, right? I love the Stamp Our Story, the whole movement, the notion that, community came together, and not just from the Japanese American community, but from other aspects of the US community. And then what I learned today too was the fact that there were European communities who also supported the effort. So I would love to hear a little bit about how Ms. Takahashi started, what triggered her, and how difficult it was to make this happen. Linda or Wayne?
Yeah, sure. Linda can share it too, because she and I have been working on the stamp effort for a number of years, so she can share as well in about Oregon's involvement. But Fusa Takahashi, she and her good friend Aiko Ogata King were at the Japanese American National Museum viewing an exhibit, and part of the exhibit was on the Nisei soldiers of World War II. And Fusa is the widow of a military intelligence service veteran. And so she knows intimately the whole story of the Nisei soldiers. And Aiko is a U.S. Army nurse of the Korean War era. And both of them were childhood friends who were both sent to the Amachi, Colorado incarceration camps as young teens. And so they went through that whole experience together and stayed together their whole lives. And after viewing the exhibit in 2005, they said, you know what, we have to think of ways to really reach people, especially young people today, you know what, and others who don't know the story at all. So they said, what could we do? And Aiko, who collected stamps, and Fusa, who appreciates stamps, they thought, you know what, how about we do a stamp? You know, they can do stamps to honor actors. They can do stamps to honor cartoon characters, lots of things. And they said, if ever there was a stamp subject deserving of commemoration, this is one of them, you know, let's do it. And so they started to contact their family members and friends, and it literally was like became viral. I mean, they friends talked to friends, family members talked to family members, and one thing led to another. I came in about a year later when their good friend Chiz Ohira, who passed away a couple years ago, she's local from Gardena, and she's the widow of the late Ted Ohira, who is a 442 veteran from Hawaii. But she approached me when I worked at the Go for Broke National Education Center, which is a wonderful resource on the Go for Broke story, all the soldiers. And also they have an oral history program that you can watch videos even about Ted and others telling their stories. But Chiz Ohira approached me, you know, we're doing this stamp campaign. Let's, can you help us? We need some help on the computers. We don't know computers that well. So when I heard about it, I'm like, of course, I'm going to help you. What can I do? What do you need? And as I mentioned before, it's very near and dear to my heart. So I started getting involved, and one thing led to another, and we grew the campaign. But Valina, it's really interesting. You contextualized one of the last scenes where Miwako is 79, and she's, you know, they're corresponding she's corresponding with Hank. That is the age, the approximate age that Fusa and Aiko were when they started the stamp campaign. And, you know, they had kept in touch all these years. So that was just kind of an interesting kind of crossover that for people and especially younger people in the audience, that, you know, these generations shrink artistically in our minds when we have memories. And I like the last scene where they're dancing together, and that's something that, you know, I love to look at pictures of my Nisei elders when they were younger, especially that time period, and you see them happy and boisterous and alive, and to think of all the things that they endured during the wartime and after the war, and, you know, that really brings home, like, wow, you know, all that they did, and that all these men and women served in the U.S. Army. Many gave their lives. Over 800 were killed in action during the war of Japanese American Nisei soldiers. So, you know, to think of their youth and what they did bravely during the war. Yeah, so I really liked that part of the play.
Well, thank you. You know, one of the pictures I love the most at the Japanese American National Museum's standing exhibit of the Japanese American experience during World War II is a picture of my friend Takayo, who is water skiing in a bathing suit. And whenever I see that picture of her, and I think she's 16 or 17, it's just amazing to look back on those years. And she also told me that there was a great deal of turmoil about the fact that the particular bathing suit she chose to wear for the photo shoot, and her parents' reaction. So, Tamara, I wanted to ask you, often people talk about how theater and the arts, that they have the mechanism for presenting a story that pulls in history, and that it can be very transformative in terms of, what we recollect, or the fact that we recollect it all. So what was your experience like directing, Tamlin and Toru through such a journey?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I did not know that that picture was Takayo, and now I can't wait to go back and see that. It's going to put her in a whole new light for me. Well, I mean, first of all, these actors are, above and beyond and amazing to work with. Not the first time I've worked with them, but they're absolutely lovely and bring 110% every time, which is amazing. But what I've always loved about your work is that you always learn something. And I love how you juxtapose harsh realities with just love. And even though this is a friendship, it's still love, and just how we learned something about this event, and we're going to be, promoting this stamp, which is a very important aspect of this project. But just how you'll internalize it more through this storytelling, I feel like, because you remember the love that people had for the lives that were lost and the people that went through these camps. It really makes it personal for people who do not know someone directly who were, incarcerated. So, yeah, it's really been a wonderful experience being part of this project. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Linda, I was so moved too by the music and the pictures, the photographs that you shared with us, and George Akiyama's story just really was heartbreaking to me. And I would love to hear more about, I sense that they're part of a larger project, so I'd love to hear about that.
Oh, well, to make a long story short, I had actually been encouraged to ask questions of the Nisei in my community, because they had interesting stories. And that's when I began to interview 13 Nisei. And I also learned about the notoriety in my hometown. I didn't know about the honor roll, and I didn't know about camp. And so after I wrote a book about the Nisei, I really wanted to learn more about the Nisei veterans. And so had a chance to interview George and others. One thing that I think is important about that project, but also that ties the stamp and your play together, are really, we're going beyond shikataganai. And one of the things I heard a lot from the Nisei, when I'd ask them a question, well, did you think about saying, no, I have my rights, I'm not going to camp? And they said, oh, shikataganai. And I got a little bit worried about that. So what I hope that we're hearing and what we're conveying is that there are ways to be active citizens, and we can speak out and have our say, but we can also speak out for others. As Captain Sheldon Lawrence did, one of my goals too is to focus on, as I say, heroes and heralded, those who spoke out for Japanese Americans, even when they themselves might have been impugned. And there are so many ways where we can speak out for others, whether it's the Jewish community, whether it's immigrants at the border. We really have experience with this, our heritage does. So we really need to speak out. And maybe one other thing is that I hope that the younger generation will ask questions of mom and dad and grandpa and great grandpa if they're there, because so many of the Nisei and Nisei don't share their stories because nobody asked. And sometimes it simply takes an invitation. We've got a wealth of gammon in our past, and we need to tap that.
The spirit of what you're saying is something that I found very moving in a play called Tales of Clamor by Tracy Kato Kiriyama and Kennedy Cabasares, and this notion of it cannot be helped. It can be helped, that there has to be clamor, that we have to face what happened to us, and to raise the questions and to come up with responses to show that it can be helped. I mean, the redress and reparations was all about, the fact that it can be helped. So I think that's very powerful. And the other thing that it makes me think of is Susan Kamei just published a new book, When Can We Go Back to America? And this notion of, what is America? And the fact that US citizens during World War II, Japanese American citizens, were incarcerated, then their whole understanding of what America was shifted at that point. And there was, that need to show that they were loyal Americans, which is why so many Nisei went to fight in World War II and largely in the 100th Battalion and the 442nd. And Wayne has pointed out to me too that we usually hear the 442nd, but we don't hear about the 100th Battalion. So I urge you to look into that, if you're interested. And that's why all of us wanted to embrace both of them in our ideas. But I think there's a lot of discussion. And I think that even though it's something that happened a while ago, we do have to remember, because it's an important part of US history. And as Linda and Wayne, we've all pointed out, and the play points out, that, past is prologue. And if we ignore the past, then we will relive it. And, we already began to relive it in the last few years with the Muslim community in America, and how they were treated and how they were perceived. So we don't have any questions in the chat. I'm looking to make sure that I cover everybody, and I wanted to make sure that for all of you, if there was anything else that you wanted to share about the movement towards creating the stamp, or the play, and also the musical excerpts and the photographs, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I wanted to share that Linda and I have roots in Hood River, Oregon, and that's where we first got to know each other, because Linda's book, the Nisei, Hood River Nisei, featured my grandparents, and she interviewed both my grandmother and grandfather, and got their experience. And then to her credit, I mean, Linda keeps going. She's just a fireball with all of these ideas, and she's just so involved in many aspects of the community. And when I asked her, hey, would you like to help in the stamp campaign, she was all about it. I mean, she's the daughter of a Nisei World War II soldier, and so she knows that part of the story. Anyway, and my mom's best friend's husband is George Akiyama. So George's wife, Ruth, who's still alive, I just spoke with her yesterday. She is really, she's connected to my family, and I've known them for since I was a little boy. And she shared that she and George, interestingly, met each other in Portland after the war. And many people, the Nisei especially, shared common background, and they would find each other in all these different cities. They met in Portland, Oregon. And when they were, Ruth was needed a ride to church, and George offered to take her. So that's kind of how it started. And then, they, you talk about shikata ganai and gaman, which means to endure, and go for broke, of course, comes from Hawaiian slang, meaning just to go for with everything you got, your important goals, go for broke, go until you're broken, or stems from the Issei instilling the gambaru spirit. And gambaru, if you don't know, maybe you already know, many of you, but it means hang in there, just keep going, the goal is important, keep at it. So my Nisei elders instilled that in me, and Fusa, Aiko, and Chiz and the other Nisei who helped in the stamp campaign really helped keep that going in us. And as Sansei and Yonsei participated in the stamp campaign and overseas in France when we had help there, we all persevered even though the Postal Service kept saying no. We really didn't know until it was announced last year if they would ever do it. But as fate would have it, we're so fortunate and happy that the Postal Service would finally issue the stamp. But we used that Nisei spirit of go for broke, of gaman, of enduring, sometimes the unendurable. You just keep at it. Those are Japanese kind of qualities, and that's something that the Issei instilled in the Nisei, and that we still feel today. So
yeah, I think it's so important, and it's wonderful that this community energy combined to make a difference. Really, you talk about social change and justice. If revisiting and reclaiming history isn't part of that, then I don't know what is. So I think it's great that the community came together, and I think that what's wonderful, about Linda's work and what we're doing here today, Tamara, in directing the play, that we've combined that community energy and the transformative power of the arts to make a difference in terms of social change and reclaiming a history that is, has relatively been lost to the masses, perhaps not to those of us who are connected to Japanese American culture in some way, but certainly to the masses. So thank you, Linda and Wayne, and all of the Stamp Our Story people for doing that. And thank you, Tamara, for directing the play. Linda, thank you for the musical excerpts as well. And of course, we're very grateful to the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture for supporting this event. And today, we could not have done it without Shannon and Jesse. So thank you so much for helping us. And again, to the audience, I really am grateful. We're all grateful for you to come and join us today and take this journey with us. So thank you very much for attending.